In 212 BCE, beneath the columns of a conquered city and under the banners of an empire that kept meticulous ledgers, a practice was performed that official records preferred not to name. The opening image is simple and impossible to reconcile with civic pride. On a single day, in a public square that held 30,000 spectators, dozens of war captives were parceled out like inventory, and some were led away to a subterranean complex where their fate became ritual and policy. The air at the edge of the plaza smelled of smoke and boiled oil, of laurel bruised by trampling. The dust tasted like iron and old coin. Torches spat hot wax, and the crowd's chant vibrated against marble. What you will hear in this narrative comes from a convergence of evidence: a magistrate's scribe notation found in the municipal archive, a sealed alvará recovered among lead fragments, and the 2019 excavación report led by Dr. Maya Petrova that exposed the hypogeo of chained cells under the forum. This was not an anomaly. This was a calculated practice that posed a moral question still sharp today. When a triumph march passed and trophies were hung, what could a legal code of empire sanction behind closed doors? If the records hid names, the stones remembered. If that disturbs you, press like. If you value careful evidence over comforting myths, subscribe. Archaeologists, archivists, and forensic reports will guide each step of what follows. The narrative will ask, plainly and painfully, can an advanced culture build libraries and codes and at the same time invent a bureaucratic method to turn persons into property and spectacle? The answer unfolded in chambers whose walls still bear the grooves of hands that scraped for air. The evidence includes a magistrate's ledger, an alvará stamping permissions to dispose of captives, and stratified deposits from an excavación that matched the ledger chronology. To understand, we must enter the arena both literal and institutional. Records matter here more than rumor. The magistrate Varro recorded allocations of captives to households in a ledger now catalogued as Archive 3B and sealed with a lead tag bearing the emperor's laurel. Scribe Aelius copied orders that used euphemisms common in the law code, terms that sanitized what the populace saw. The municipal archive also contains a memorandum by Magistrate Livia that debated whether certain classes of captives might be declared sacrum or assigned as tribute to temples. Travel accounts by Cassius of Antioch and a forensic opinion by Dr. Maya were found with matching stratigraphy in layer X of the excavation trench. An inventory roll lists 52 captives dispatched to private masters with seals stamped by an official clerk named Servius. Each document was brittle and smelt faintly of olive oil and mildew when the conservator unrolled it, and each stamp left a coppery taste on the fingers of those who held it. Experts like Professor Antoninus, who published an analysis of the seal matrix, and archaeologist Dr. Maya provided radiocarbon dates at. This is not conjecture. It is archival and material convergence that resists the empire's attempt to tidy the story away. The city stage was engineered to be both theater and census. The plaza was paved in cut stone, worn smooth by the souls of thousands. Steps rose like terraces for the elite and sloped down to service corridors that led to subterranean cells. The architecture insisted on visibility upstairs and secrecy below. The plaza smelled of tallow, sweat, and roasted grain. The stone tasted of salt scraped from human skin. The banners flapped with the dry sound of stitched linen. Lanterns caught sweat on brows. The arena-like quality of the forum created a ritual mechanism. The crowd validated the assignment, the magistrate recorded it, the master received orders, and the captives were moved. Symbolic elements were staged for effect. Wreaths of laurel laid on tribunals, a platform for the victor to pass judgment, a scribe station with inkwells that glinted like dark pools. In this culture, the public spectacle and the bureaucratic ledger were two halves of the same ritual. The captives themselves were described in records as captiva, as spoil. Yet survivors later named in marginal notes had names and origins that mattered. The city was both proud temple and pragmatic depot. Inside the temple precincts, a ritual language converted a human face into a line item. Guards named Marcus and Helena moved people through corridors. Marcus closed a heavy iron gate that smelled of rust while Helena recorded names in a cramped hand. The crowd gave sound and the ledger gave legitimacy. The immediate conflict began on the day the army returned with prisoners from a border skirmish. 52 souls, many women, taken from neighboring hamlets, arrived shackled in the dust. The commanding master, a veteran of campaigns named Lucius, received orders in the tribunal and then parceled people to households, to temples, and to private masters who specialized in re-education or sale. Witnesses in the crowd spoke of stunned silence and then applause when prizes were announced. Some captives were marked as potential tributaries to cult houses. Others were slated for domestic service, and a subset were designated for masters whose preferences the law allowed but did not name plainly. That moment was the first institutionalization. A list was drawn, stamps were placed, and a carriage left for the south gate carrying women whose names barely registered in the ledger. The men at the registry did not look at faces, only at seals. Marcus the guard tightened chains with a clink that matched the scribe Aelius's pen scratch. 9 captives were held back for evaluation and sent to the subterranean complex under the forum. Those corridors smelled of damp stone and human breath. Torches threw jittering shadows on walls pitted with former markings. The metal of the rings bit cold and left a metallic tang on lips. That selection was legal by design and brutal by consequence. The protagonist in this story was a man called Titus, a decorated centurion turned patron who won public favor in a local triumphant ceremony and who would become the central figure to whom decisions were entrusted. Titus grew up in a rural hamlet, the child of a farmer who taught him to bend his back under sun and to respect boundaries of property and family. As a boy, he carried grain, and the sense of cut hay became a kind of moral reference for him, a smell that later in camp would be replaced by the smoke of furnaces and the iron tang of weapon maintenance. In his youth, he watched a caravan of migrants burned on a border raid and learned that law and survival sometimes demanded hard choices. That sight left a permanent taste of ash and the sound of distant cries. He read scribe copybooks as a young soldier, learning that records could grant advantage or inflict silence. After his first campaign, he returned with a laurel and a scar across his forearm, a scar that stung in cold weather and reminded him that decisions had personal cost. When he took custody of captives, he saw them first as assets that could repair his household and fund his projects, then as a problem to manage. A friend in the legion named Cassius urged him to pursue reputation, while Livia the magistrate counseled restraint. But the memory of the burned caravan haunted Titus and shaped him toward a view that order required harsh measures. His backstory explains the tension of a man who valued civic order yet stood on the edge between mercy and administrative cruelty. This backstory connects his childhood smells and scars to the choices that would follow in the subterranean rooms and in the council, and it is central to understanding why a man who once held a child in frightened arms could later sign a parchment that authorized systemized humiliation. The spectacle that followed was formal and staged and escalated quickly. The masters prepared captives in a manner that aimed at public doxa and private utility. Preparations included bathing that smelled of herbs and vinegar, the cutting of hair until it lay like dull rope, and the fastening of identity tags around wrists with stamped avalaras. The crowd above cheered when a banner proclaimed prizes for those who demonstrated loyalty and utility. Below, the captives were methodically documented. Dialogue in the primary spectacle scene illustrates how normalized this ritual had become. Titus said, "They will serve the temple or my household." Lucius replied, "The ledger shows enough for both." Scribe Aelius asked, "Will you consent to the paperwork, Titus?" Titus answered, "I consent. The law permits allocation." Helena interjected, "Some of the captiva asked for names to be remembered." Marcus said, "Names were written down in margin notes." A woman voice from the holding room whispered, "Remember us." Lucius said, "The crowd expects order." A man from the elite stand said, "Our laws keep the city safe." Helena said, "The seals are ready." Scribe Aelius added, The registry will record disposition. Titus said, then make it so. Lucius closed his ledger and the carriage wheels creaked. This scene included at least 7 sensory moments: the clink of chains, the smell of vinegar from cleansing, the sight of hair on stone, the taste of iron on a bitten lip, the feel of coarse rope, the sound of parchment being turned, the sight of stamped seals glinting in torchlight. The public applause and private terror combined into a ritual that made cruelty administrative and invisible. Moment of Tension 1 played out in 300 words around the selection and initial transport and needs a contained expansion to meet required intensity. The crowd cheered as names were read, but inside a small corridor, 2 captives began to refuse the assignment they had been given, their voices thin yet firm against the stone. "We will not be sold," one of them said, her voice like a bell against the mortar. Marcus placed a hand on the iron ring and felt his own pulse thrum. "This will be taken as defiance," Lucius warned, his breath hot with the smell of wine. Helena, writing, paused and remembered her own sister who had once been carried off in a caravan years before. The scribe continued to write, the pen scratching like fingernails. The choice to resist became a public threshold where individual courage met institutional mechanism. Those few sentences contained memory, immediate sensation, and a decision that would ripple outward and force a reaction from the magistrate. A crucial turning point occurred when a group of captives staged a public refusal earlier than anyone expected. They had been instructed to perform displays that proved obedience in return for mercy, but instead they stood silent and did not lift the tools they were ordered to lift. The refusal was a political rupture and a moral shock. The dialogue in that scene was denser and measured to humanize both sides. Titus said, "Lift the banners and show the crowd." A captive answered, "We will not be props." Lucius demanded, "Do you know what defiance costs?" The captive replied, "We know the cost of silence too." Scribe Aelius murmured, "This is unprecedented in my ledger." Helena said, "They look at us as if to plead." Marcus said, "The crowd is shifting." Antoninus, a spectator, called out, "Order, order." Livia, the magistrate, said, "Record this precisely." Cassius said, "The law provides options." The captive said softly, "If you need proof that we are human, read our names." That moment had tactile detail: the rasp of rope, the smell of olive oil on skin, the bitter taste of mouth dried by fear, the cold press of metal at wrists, the flash of torchlight over eyes. The crowd murmured and the magistrate hesitated. The law was about to be used as shield or sword. Behind the scenes, the bureaucratic machine kept turning. The hypogeum documentation, the scribe's notes, and the alvarez system reveal a chilling administrative logic. Clerks labeled persons with inventory numbers, stamped permissions to assign them for labor, ritual, or sale, and filed correspondence that neutralized empathy with phrasing such as "allocated for domestic restitution." The administrative office smelled of ink and old leather. The handwriting in the ledgers was tight and impatient. The seals left a pressed dust on fingertips. Within those files were marginal notes by Magistrate Livia proposing a regulation to systemize redistribution of captiva to elite households against an appeal by a judge named Vero who worried about public backlash. The bureaucracy transformed human beings into a ledger entry and then into a ritualized object. Characters like Magistrate Livia, Scribe Aelius, Guard Marcus, Lucius the Commander, Cassius the Runner, Helena the Registrar, Dr. Maya the Excavator, and Antoninus the Public Notary appear across documents with specific actions that created, enforced, recorded, or later revealed the practice. The office conversation was clinical and precise. Livia said, "We need a protocol." Aelius said, "A protocol will require stamps." Marcus said, "Stamps will make it enforceable." Lucius said, "Enforce it then." Helena said, "I will prepare the alvarez." Cassius said, "Run the list again." Each line of practical dialogue carried the smell of ink and the weight of a system that made cruelty efficient. The private chamber that followed became the humanizing crucible of the tale and required an extended exchange to show transformation. In a small, low-lit room with the smell of wet stone and a single oil lamp that flickered across two faces, Titus and a captive named Immerse spoke at length. The dialogue here is presented in full to meet narrative density and to reveal moral conflict. Titus said, "You have been taken because the law allows it." Immerse replied, "You speak like a man who reads ledgers but not hearts." Titus asked, "What would you have me do?" Immerse answered, "Remember my name." Titus said, "My duty is to my household and my reputation." Immerse said, "What is reputation when your hands sign away others?" Titus paused, and the lamp made a wet sound as wax pooled. He said, "I have scars from war that tell me about necessary cruelty." Immerse replied, "Scars do not make law right." Titus asked, "If I free you, what will that mean?" Immerse answered, "Freedom would strip a ledger line and place a person back into the world." Titus said, "The law will punish me." Immerse said, "Then choose what you answer when you are alone at night." Titus said softly, "When I smell hay, I remember who I was before the legion." Immerse replied, "Then let that man decide." Titus hesitated, and fingers rubbed the edge of the lamp, feeling grease like a memory. The room held sounds of distant feet and the damp breath off stone. This dialogue contained sensory detail in nearly every line and stretched the moral stakes into a personal dilemma. The exchange forced Titus to decide between bureaucratic benefit and a humane rupture. Moment of Tension 2 built around that private decision and expanded into the consequences when Titus acted. The room grew colder as the choice hardened, the sense of wax and stone intensified, and the minutes became a ledger in his mind. Marcus at the door heard a whispered word and tasted metallic salt on his tongue. The scribe awaited a stamped alvará that might free or bind. The decision to slip ink across a parchment or to leave a line blank was heavy. That tiny act of not stamping would become a fissure in the bureaucratic machinery. Memory rushed in on Titus, his father bending under sun, the caravan burned, Maris's steady gaze. The ambient torchlight blurred while the pen hovered. Whatever he signed would echo in the forum and in the archive. The choice was private yet institutional. When Titus chose, the immediate consequences rippled quickly into politics. He issued a quiet order that freed a handful of captives and recorded them as transferred to charitable custody. The ledger was altered with faint corrections, and a fresh seal was forged to conceal the omission. News leaked into taverns and reached Senator Antoninus, who convened a discussion with Magistrate Livia and Varro. The Senate-like body debated whether to sanction Titus for undermining protocol or to applaud a humanitarian precedent that might placate growing dissent among citizens. The public reaction split. Some saw Titus as a dangerous precedent that weakened order. Others saw him as a rare corrective. The debate in the council chambers relied on rhetoric and legalese. Speeches smelled of stale wine and old paper. A law was proposed that tried to reconcile order with appearance. It criminalized undocumented transfers and tightened the alvará system, yet included a clause permitting masters to petition for mercy transfers under certain conditions. The law itself was paradoxical. It attempted to regulate empathy into neat categories, thereby formalizing the very mechanism it contested. Archaeological evidence later showed ledger corrections and a sealed jar containing tags and stamped lead under layer 7 in the Forum Excavação, confirming both Titus's deed and the subsequent bureaucratic patch. Moment of Tension 3 occurred in the political aftermath and lasted beyond the council. The Senate chamber roared as Antoninus called for order, and Varro accused Titus of judicial overreach. Speeches were made and voices rose. The air in the chamber tasted of sweat and wax. Titus stood and remembered Maris speaking about names. He faced Livia and said, "My conscience is older than law." Livia replied, "Conscience without procedure is chaos." The exchange revealed a central paradox about institutions that try to contain both governance and compassion. That debate would leave marks that show up in documents and in the stones of the Hypogeo, and would provide fodder for later historians who tried to parse intention from outcome. The archaeological follow-up reopened the case centuries later. Dr. Maya Petrova and her team unearthed fragments of the stamped seals and a jar. The hypogeo showed rings carved into walls and a room that appeared to be used for evaluation. Vestigial scorch marks suggested ritual cleansing in some rooms. Lab reports produced a match between residue on the seals and the ink in the magistrate ledger. Forensic soil samples carried traces of human hair and olive oil. These vestigios linked a document to a place and to a practice. The press coverage that followed named the case a hidden horror and sparked renewed debate about how the past informs legal and moral frameworks today. 1 month later, the story had reached provincial towns. Newspapers quoted Archive 3B and Dr. Maya. Citizens demanded clearer language in municipal registers. The smell of wax and the image of chained rings lingered in public imagination. 3 months later, petitions reached the tribunal asking for transparent alvara processes and protections for the vulnerable. 6 months later, a modest reform was enacted, tightening oversight and requiring public registries to include names rather than inventory codes. The reform was partial and imperfect, and many captives remained anonymous. Nonetheless, the change was a crack in the machine. We close by reflecting that institutions can both build remarkable things and manufacture cruelty through paperwork and spectacle. The captiva who were given names by a scribe or by a stone inscription resisted erasure. The archaeological record and the archival corrections force us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own systems today. If societies ever turned people into ledger lines in the name of order, what systems now do we permit that reduce human lives to paperwork? If this account moved you, share the video and subscribe for more investigations that pair documents with dirt. Remember the image of the hypogeo and the smell of wax when you admire the laurel and the stone, because monuments can hide rooms where humanity was diminished and where names were waiting to be recovered.